ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Toward a Quality of Life here in the month of July. Tonight our topic is going to be about the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. And my guest tonight, who is very knowledgeable on the subject and who works very hard for a just peace in that area, is Hilda Silverman. She's with the Jewish Women for Justice in Israel and Palestine, and she also works with the Cambridge Peace Commission. She's a person who's been involved in progressive politics for quite some time, and this matter of Israel is near and dear to her heart. Good. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Why is this so near and dear to your heart, this Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we hear so much about?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a family, and particularly with grandmothers, who were totally devoted to creating a Jewish state. I mean, I was born before the state. The state was founded in 1948, and I'm older than that. And I remember how excited my one grandmother was raising money for Youth Aliyah to bring refugee Jewish children to the area that then became the Jewish state. One grandmother went there many times with a cousin of hers over the years after the state was founded, and was thrilled. My grandmother was very progressive. She used to say she would have joined the Communist Party if she'd had the $5, and she was very progressive. Her children sent her on these trips, and she just came back with glowing reports of how green the land was and how wonderful, and it was such an exciting thing. And I just took that all in. I mean,
why was it important for there to be a land known as Israel where Jews live?
Right. Well, the known as Israel isn't so important, but where Jews live, I think it was mostly for Jews to feel safe, that the sort of the background of political Zionism was in large measure at the end of the 18th century, that there was rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and Jews felt unsafe and felt that they would not be welcomed in much of the world. Then the Holocaust in the 40s, the Second World War ended in 1945, and there was increasing pressure for Jews, survivors of the Holocaust particularly, who were in displaced person camps at that point, to have some place to go. Many countries didn't take them, and they were taken, actually they were on illegal boats largely, to the land that was then Palestine, that became Israel.
Was there a particular interest in going to that area, of all areas of the world?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, partly that most other areas wouldn't take people, but there was also an historical tie to the land of the Old Testament is very, very deeply rooted. Jewish religious tradition is very deeply rooted in that part of the world, in Jerusalem and Hebron. And even Jews who are not personally religious, who don't believe in a personal God, would tend to, for example, celebrate Passover with family seders and things like that. And then there was ritual and stories about next year in Jerusalem. So there were long-standing Jewish ties to the land, and there was a very small Jewish population there for hundreds and hundreds of years before modern Israel was founded, that generally they were religious Jews. They weren't interested in a state particularly. They wanted to be able to practice their religion in the land that felt close to them.
I see. And so this goes back historically many
it goes back, yes, a long time.
Years
yes,
ago.
The ties to that area go back, yeah.
Okay. So also, all right then, that's a little bit about the Jewish history, very little.
Yeah.
What is the Palestinian history? Is there really a place called Palestine? Right. Are there really people that can altogether be called an entity, Palestinian?
Yeah. Well, there is a geographical area that is was called Palestine. Now, much of it is called Israel, but it was called Palestine. It was not an independent state. It was under the Ottoman Empire for many years. It was under British control, the British mandate for many years until in 1948, Israel was founded, and most of the area that had been Palestine, actually 78%, became Israel proper. Yeah.
How far back does the land known as Palestine go in history? Does that go back
Yeah.
many, many years too?
It goes back generations. I mean, one of the issues with Palestinians, it's one of the ways that people, Jews and others, justify the taking over of this land by Jews is that, oh, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, or they were just Arabs who came from other countries because there were chances for work as Jews came in there. And it's just silly. It simply isn't true. I mean, there were Palestinian families who can trace their roots generations and generations and generations. I mean, the same olive trees that that grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers tended, have been tended by Palestinians and today. So
and the Palestinians are Arab people?
They are Arab people. They are both Christian and Muslim. The majority are now Muslim, but it's not Arab or Christian. They are Arab people. They are one of many Arab people. They speak the Arabic language. They share Arab culture, and then by religion they are, most of them are Christian or Muslim. Muslim or Christian.
So as you were explaining to me even before this evening,
Right.
there was an area generally known geographically as Palestine,
Right.
even though technically it wasn't a state. There's
Yes,
a long
isn't-
heritage of
right.
families that are
Absolutely.
Palestinian that trace their
Absolutely.
roots back years and years ago. And you
Yes.
showed me a beautiful book with a wonderful flourishing civilization
Absolutely.
that was
Yeah,
Palestinian.
Yeah.
For many, many years
yeah,
before
yeah.
all these recent events of the
Right,
last century
yeah,
came to
yeah.
pass.
And it was a life that was effectively destroyed. I mean, this was an extraordinary culture. There were many people who were agricultural. There were obviously, and I think there's an understanding about that, but people were weavers, people were poets, people had English debating teams, they had soccer teams. I mean, there were photos in the book I showed you of gorgeous, beautiful weddings, Christian weddings, Muslim weddings. It was a very rich culture and with a tremendous amount of appreciation of the land.
And a lot of nice architecture too, in
Beautiful
the Arab
architect-
style of the
beautiful
Middle
architecture,
East.
Beautiful architecture. Yes, I love it. Yeah.
So the whole area was known as a Palestinian area, not quite a state, but
Right, yeah.
Palestine.
Palestine.
Just
Was
the
called Palestine. That was the term.
And it's
the
called
term that was used. I mean, Jews used that term too. That was the area that was called Palestine.
Area. No matter who uses it, Palestine always means the same area.
In general, yes. I mean, people generally, yes. There's a general understanding.
Spot on the map.
There's a general understanding about what is Palestine. Yes.
Okay. And that wasn't a very big area. It would have been
No,
a
it's
small
not.
country where it literally...
Right, yeah, I'm trying to remember. It's the size of maybe New Jersey. I mean, it's
So
the
it's
size of a state, of one of the states here. I don't remember which one, but I
Okay.
think it's about New Jersey.
All
yeah.
right, so that brings us up to the events where things no longer were Palestine as of tradition.
Right.
What happened? Take us there in the middle of the last century, more or less. What happened to make...
There was the Palestinians who were living there realized over time that there was a growing influx of Jews, and they were concerned about what was going to happen to them. And there was some resistance against this significant influx of Jews, and there was a lot of struggle back and forth. The United Nations got involved, and they came up with a plan in November of 1947 to partition the land so there would be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. This is a judgment, but my judgment and the judgment of many people who look at that plan think it was totally unfair to the Palestinian side. At that point, Jews were a third of the population. There had been a very significant influx of Jews, particularly after the Holocaust. But Jews were still only a third of the population. They only owned, at that point, 7% of the land. They would have been given 55% of the land in the Jewish state, and there would have been 45% of the land left for the Palestinian state. The Jewish side had reservations, but accepted the plan. The Arab side, including the Palestinians and the other Arab states around, it didn't look fair to them. Truth is, it wasn't fair. I mean, it wasn't, so they turned down. They could have had a Palestinian state then, but it was so much less than they thought that they should have, and it meant giving up much of the richest agricultural land too. It was not just that
So
they
the
were
best
only going to
parts
get
were going to
a lot of the best parts were going to go to the Jewish state, and both the borders were very there were awkward borders. There were a lot of problems with it, and one of the arguments that's used politically all the time is, why should Palestinians have a state now? They turned it down when they had the chance. Well, when they had the quote, when they had the chance, it didn't feel fair to them, and I can understand that. I mean, once you start to learn about this stuff, things look different. You know, things
So
don't
it
look the same
wasn't a
to me
very
now.
good deal.
It wasn't a very good deal
was a
from their
bad deal.
perspective. Yes, in retrospect, it was a lot better than anything they'll be able to get now. But they didn't know that at the time.
Was it the United Nations that was
It was the
negotiating
United
all of
Nations.
this?
Yes, it was the United
Which
Nations.
countries in particular?
I don't
Was it a
know.
council like they have now that lead the way of 5, a major?
I do not believe so, but I don't really know the details
Certainly
of that.
England
Yeah.
and the United States
Yeah,
must have played a big role.
Yes,
Yes.
and there was a lot of
Sort
pressure
of
brought
a lot
on
of
other countries
similar
to go along.
players
Yeah.
as are
It
in
was-
effect today,
my
actually.
my understanding is I think there were 33 countries voted for the partition, maybe 13 opposed, and there were some countries that abstained. But in any event, it never went into effect. The Arab side never agreed to it. There were several months of fighting. The British forces, there had been a British occupying force in a sense. It was the British mandate. They pulled out in the middle of 1948, and Israel declared that the state of Israel was declared, and then armies from the various Arab countries attacked. So it depends on, you know, it's true that there were armies from the various Arab countries that did attack. They didn't think it was fair that there was going to be this, you know, huge Jewish state there.
So let's say, too, this small territory, sort of a long, narrow one, more or less, is completely bordered by Arab states.
That's correct, except
This-
where
this
it's bordered by water,
Palestine area.
by the Mediterranean. Yeah.
And when they were dividing up the land, you say some of the better land was going to Israel.
And most of the land was going to Israel. Yeah.
And most of the land.
Yeah.
Now, we hear about water rights. Where was the precious water being more on Israel's side back then? Or?
That is probably not the case, because I'm not sure people understood, you know, where the aquifers were. But I can tell you that now we know that many of the most important aquifers, the most important sources of water, it's under areas that is not today Palestinian areas, but it's occupied Palestinian areas, and Israel is taking a great deal of that water for use by Israeli citizens inside Israel and also for settlers in that area. So now it's become a huge issue. I'm not enough of an expert on it to know what the thinking was then.
Okay. So at the time the state of Israel was brought into being, up till that time, the British had a presence in that area, and Palestine itself was not a state, as you say, though Palestinian people
live there,
occupied, were the dwellers, were the inhabitants, were native, if you will, to the area. And the British were there for what reason? How did the British end up being there at that time?
And again, I'm not an historian, but after the First World War, the British and the French particularly came in and partitioned a lot of the Arab countries.
As they did Afghanistan. Was it at the similar time, or was that later?
Was. I don't know the answer to that.
In other words, they were in that area.
They were in that area,
India.
and so it was, you know, they were colonial powers
doing
who
a lot
were
of things.
Okay,
so the British leave, and the state of Israel goes into existence.
Right.
Now you say
with a very vicious war. I mean, a war. I mean, tremendous casualties on both sides.
Is there a name for that war?
Well, yes, different people call it different things, which is typical. Israelis call it the War of Independence. But independence from whom? The British had already left. You can't say they're independent from the Palestinians. I mean, so the Palestinians call it in Arabic the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. You know, I mean, as I said, I've learned all of this in my adult life. It's so painful to learn that the exact same events that were so joyous for my family, for my grandparents, for so many people that are near and dear to me, was not only called a catastrophe, but was in fact a catastrophe for another people.
Now, sometimes you hear stories that Palestinians lost their homes, and literally people were displaced, and then what happens? Do they get any compensation for that?
No, none of that has been resolved.
How
in the
were
area.
they made to move? Just by
Well,
being fought away?
No,
or?
not as many of them. People left for many different reasons. Some of them fled because it was clear that war was coming, and the people who fled early tended to be the better educated, the wealthier, the people who had the Christians, people who had more
Means.
access. Yeah, people who had means. And people who, many of them had played leadership roles in the community, so that there were many who fled at the beginning. There was a terrible massacre in a Palestinian community called Deir Yassin, which was committed by right-wing Jewish forces, by right-wing Jewish terrorist forces. And it was a horrible massacre. There was both Arabs and Jews shared information about that, and many people fled just because they were afraid that the same things would happen in their own communities. In some places, people were physically driven out by Israeli forces who would come in and send people basically on forced marches. The Palestinians whether Palestinians were driven out or fled, they all thought they were going to come back soon. I mean, there are thousands of stories of people who brought the keys to their house with them because they thought they were going to come back. And now grandchildren and great-grandchildren still have those keys. And people flee in war because it's threatening. So people left for all kinds of reasons. I think the most significant issue, however, and certainly a very painful one for any of us who cares about justice, is that they weren't then allowed to return. And that in the Palestinian community, the issue of the right of return, which is apparently, again, I'm not an expert on this, but apparently in international law, that people who have been driven out of their homes would have the right to choose whether they want to come back to their homes, whether they want compensation, whether they want to be settled in another country. But Palestinians basically haven't been given, they've been given nothing. Many of them are refugees in camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in the area, some of the area that would have been a Palestinian state but didn't become a Palestinian state, the West Bank and Gaza, which are referred to as occupied Palestinian territories. There are also refugee camps there, and it's very sad.
When you say refugee camps, do you mean they're living like in tents or shacks or something?
Well, they were originally living in tents. I mean, I've seen incredible photographs, I'll show you one later, of the refugee camps right after the war. Today, it tends to be more shacks. I mean, very, very, very meager, tremendously crowded. Palestinians have a very high birth rate, and very, very crowded and very, very impoverished living conditions. Yeah.
So they've not been able to get beyond impoverishment, or?
Well, some have, but on balance, many of the refugees, particularly those who are still in refugee camps, have not been. Now, one of the arguments that's used by people who are supporters of the Israeli view, I don't know how to say this because I'm a supporter in some ways, but people who will say the Jews were all right and the Palestinians were all wrong will say, but it's up to the Arab countries. These were Arabs, they should have taken them in, they should have welcomed them, they should have made them citizens, they should have given them jobs. We did that with Jews who came from Arab countries. Israel, although the original influx of Jews who came to Israel were from Europe, the sort of another wave, which was more in the 1950s, were Jews who came from Arab countries, because after Israel was founded and after there was war between Israel and the Arab countries, they weren't terribly welcomed in Arab countries, and their lives were harder. And Israel wanted refugees; they wanted them to come, so they were encouraged in various ways to come. So
why did they want refugees?
They wanted a Jewish state. They felt that they needed, it's still an issue today, that they needed to have a very significant Jewish presence, especially since the surrounding area was all Arab. So there's been a big, big push to bring Jews to Israel. And there's pressure for Jews all over the world to go to Israel. I mean, it's called, for a Jew like me, who lives in the diaspora, to go to Israel is called making aliyah. That's a Hebrew word that means going up. It's considered even if you're not religious, it's considered a positive thing. And Jews who leave Israel, I think they're called yerida, which means going down. There's a lot of mythology about what it means to have this Jewish state.
You said you live in the diaspora. What does that mean?
It means, it's a term that means, I'm trying to think of where it originated. It probably originated because Jews had been, were dispersed from the area that became Palestine and then Israel in biblical times and later, and felt that they were away from their homes. And so the term diaspora means not in their own homeland. But now the term has been, is used by Palestinians also. That beautiful book I showed you was called Before Their Diaspora. So using the term diaspora for Palestinians also after they fled or were driven out from and not allowed to return to their land.
What does Zionism mean? I know that's what we could bring a library here as to what it means, but
it means different things to different people. I do want to say there was a strain of Zionism which would be the one that I personally would adhere to, which would support the notion of having a place where Jews could practice their religion if they wanted to, and have a cultural attachment to Judaism, but would be a binational state, to the extent if it's in the area that's Israel or Palestine, where it would be a binational state. So it would be a Jewish-Arab state, and both groups would have power, and there would be joint control. There is one amazing village within Israel called Neve Shalom, Wahat al-Salam, which means, that's the Hebrew, the Arabic, and in English it's Oasis of Peace. Now it's been going for many years. It's small, and it's an area that's deliberately made up of Jews and Palestinians, all with Israeli citizenship, who have joint control of their lives and of their communities, and they have schools that are bilingual, bicultural. They celebrate Jewish, Christian, and Muslim holidays. It's just a remarkable place, and they run a school for peace where they bring in teenagers from both communities around
Which
the
part
country.
of the territory is that in?
It's in Israel itself.
Is it north, south, or?
It's sort of between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's not easy to get to, actually.
Things
sort
can
of
be
middle.
difficult
Yeah,
to get to?
things can be difficult
What
to
makes
get
it
to.
difficult to get to?
No, it's just
no,
not.
but how is the land there that it's difficult? There's some travel is difficult to get to?
Yeah, it's not. It's just it
Sort
isn't
of
on a
dusty
regular road.
Dusty
Yeah,
roads?
yeah,
Dusty
something like that.
roads.
Well,
Not well-traveled roads. So there are areas like that.
Oh yeah,
Dusty.
there are areas. I don't know. I mean, it's
More remote areas,
more
kind
remote.
of.
That's a better
Wow.
description. Yeah, there is some more remote.
More
areas
remote
there.
areas. You often hear that many of the Palestinians are in Jordan. Is that so? Is that like where the majority of refugees are? Or people who were refugees
some
who
of
may
them are.
now be well established in Jordan?
Well, in Jordan they have both. They have people who are still in refugee camps, but they also have people who are citizens in Jordan and have risen fairly high in that society. My understanding is that the majority of the people in Jordan are now Palestinian, are Palestinian background.
Really?
And see, Israeli right-wingers will say, why does there need to be another Palestinian state? There's already a Palestinian state in Jordan, because, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's not true. I mean, it's a different, it's adjacent, but it's a different area. But the majority, my understanding is that the majority of the people there are Palestinian.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's not a dual citizenship. They just become Jordanian citizens. They're
yes.
not.
Yeah, but they would probably, many of them would identify themselves as Palestinians with Jordanian citizenship.
And Jordan itself is an area sort of, what is Jordanian? That's another whole story, which we're not going to get into. But so it's complicated. Why are some Palestinian citizens in Israel and others not in the area?
Sure. What happened is in 1947, 48, 49, around the time of the Israel was established and there was a war, I think there had been about 800,000 Palestinians in the area that became Israel proper, of whom about 650,000 fled or were driven out and weren't allowed back. So a small number of those original, Palestinian inhabitants remained. I think it's around 140 to 150,000. Those people became citizens of Israel if they were in the area that became Israel, and they've multiplied. So those are the ones that they have citizenship. They are definitely second or third class citizens. There are various ways in which they are discriminated against. It's very complicated because many people will say, well, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, in some sense that's true. Palestinians who are citizens can vote, for example. They can be part of the Israeli parliament, which is the
they
Knesset.
are, right?
Yes, which they are. I mean, there are ways in which it's true. But there are other ways that are very sophisticated in the way the system is organized, in which they are profoundly discriminated against. I mean, the simplest is that the Palestinian towns and villages are not provided with the same services. I mean, they, you know, in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of roads, in terms of sewer, in terms of all those things. But the more complicated piece is how the kind of other ways that they're discriminated against. Land ownership, so much of the land, almost all the land in Israel is effectively owned by the state and can only be leased to Jews. Yeah, there's profound discrimination in housing and land. I mean, land is what this conflict is about.
Land is effectively owned by the state.
Owned by the state,
and
yeah,
you lease
and
it.
control. Yeah, and it's Jews who get to lease most of the land. I mean, there are ways in which Palestinians are enormously discriminated. They have a lot of trouble, even in Israel proper, getting permits to expand if a family has grown and they need to put on an extra bedroom, an extra story or something. They try and can't get a permit. They build without a permit, and then the place is demolished. I mean, it's really, the issue of housing demolitions is a very painful one. That happens both in Israel and in the occupied territories.
In a way, this is just a sort of common, a layperson's notion of being Jewish. I won't say Judaism,
right,
but of being Jewish,
right,
belonging to the group, whether you're religious or not.
Right.
That sort of has a history of saying this group is on its own terms. It's somewhat exclusive to a degree of not exclusive as in exclusive in that either you're Jewish or you're not Jewish. Either you're part of that group or you're not part of that group. And not a lot of room for something in between. You know, to share.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Identity.
Yeah, identity. Yes, a Jewish identity. And right, it's true that many people, and I'm one of them actually, who I feel very strongly identified as a Jew, but I'm not religious at all. I mean, I actually belong to a Jewish secular organization. Whereas I wouldn't be so likely for someone to identify themselves as a Lutheran if they were, if they weren't involved in the religion. So I think it's true. I think there is something about Jewish identity. I mean, it's
the idea of calling people Jews and non-Jews, the Gentile and the Goyim, and
yeah, but it's a complicated history that led to that because of, I mean, one of the ways that Jews maintained themselves as a people over the generations was to live, especially those who were religious, and many were, very separate lives. I mean, they had rules about food, they had rules about the Sabbath, they had rules about all kinds of things, about transportation on some holidays, and marriage and all those things.
Who should sit at the table and so forth.
All those things. So that was so that there was a religious basis, and then, of course, there was profound discrimination against them in many areas. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I grew up in a town, I grew up in Gloucester, and I knew which parts of Gloucester were closed to Jews. I knew where Jews couldn't buy land in Gloucester. I knew my mother played golf, and we knew that the country club that was close to our house, where she could have, would have been convenient for her, she couldn't play golf at because there was discrimination, and she went to the next town to join a golf club. Those are tiny, tiny little things compared to the horrors we're talking about. But it's not so long ago. I'm describing the 40s and the 50s when there was a great deal of discrimination against Jews in this country. I think it's much, much, much less now. But.
Yeah, and also maybe they fortunately banded together quite well to effectively to help themselves.
Some of that, but also there's been in this country there's been an enormous amount of assimilation. I mean, a tremendous amount, very, very high level of intermarriage and children not being raised as Jews. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons that many leaders in the established Jewish community urge Jewish young people to go to Israel to get a sense of, first to visit, maybe then to live there, to get a sense of their Jewishness, because if they stay here, they marry, outside of the religion.
And that's frowned upon. Kind of.
Well, we're fairly small people. You have to understand in the Holocaust, 1/3 of the Jewish people worldwide and 2/3 of the Jews in Europe were killed. So, you know, this is in the 40s. And I think there is a sense that there is some value in maintaining, and I share that view,
Definitely.
maintaining
I'm myself, I'm not an ethnically oriented person,
right.
period.
Okay.
Period.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
I,
and
you
there've
know,
been so
but
many
I understand
yes.
people. I'm not a
Right.
cult. I'm not a hang on to your culture person or any
Right.
of that. You know.
Yeah.
So, that's just my point of view.
Right.
So now we have a land that is over a series of events. It started
Right,
out
yeah.
55 to Israel, 45 to Palestinians.
Which they didn't accept. And
Which
so
they didn't accept.
Right.
And then over a series of events, including the 1967 war,
Right.
it ended up today that, I believe you told me, that Israel owns what is effectively 78?
Well, 78%, but they captured the other 22% in the 67 war.
They
so they basically captured the whole thing.
area.
So, but
they
there
either
was,
got to be 78% literally, and then they captured
they
the rest.
captured the other 22% in a war.
And in a word, they got to be the 78% through a series of...
Well, through the that was based on the armistice lines in the 1948 war. They captured more in the war than they would have been allotted under the United Nations
initial United
partition
Nation
plan.
thing. So
Yeah.
they got more, it
Yeah.
became 78%,
Yeah.
and the 67 war happened,
Yeah.
where Egypt, did Egypt attack Israel?
Well,
The planes?
Egypt. Well, no.
No?
What? I mean, there's dispute about every one of these facts.
Yeah.
My understanding is that for the 67 war was in the beginning of June in 1967. For the month or so before that, there were terrible threats coming from the Arab world, particularly Egypt, that they were going to attack Israel.
Because
And,
just the age-old dilemmas?
No, it wasn't just the age-old dilemmas. And you know, something I should
Can't
know
think.
the answer to
Okay,
that
but-
question, but I can't. Whatever. I don't want to be wrong, and I'm not absolutely
Okay.
sure at this point. But there was a lot of tension building up, and in the end, Israel attacked preemptively. So the first strike was from Israel.
See, I wasn't
but
even aware
the
of
first
that.
strike was from
Yeah.
Israel, but there had been very, very, very serious threats, and certainly Jews all over the world, including in Israel, absolutely believed that it was going to be another Holocaust, that this was going to be a destruction, that they believed these really, horrifying threats. The truth of the matter is that Israel, by that time, had more military power than any combination of Arab governments. And they knew it, but their people didn't know it, and people all over the world didn't, particularly Jews didn't know it all over the world. So it looked like a massive victory when Israel won. And something we haven't even talked about, we haven't talked about Jerusalem, because part of Jerusalem, including the most holy place in Jewish life, which is the wall from the old temple in Jerusalem, had been captured by Jordan in the 1948 war, and it was captured back by Israel in 67, so that both religious and secular Jews, and when you read these unbelievable descriptions of what it meant to have access to, this
The
very
Wailing
special
Wall.
holy place. Yes, or the Western Wall. It's
The
called
Western Wall.
different things. Yeah.
Okay, so then after 67, they occupied what remainder was
Right.
now not them,
Right.
and that 22% is what's called the occupied
Yeah, we
territory.
call it the
Now,
occupied
what
territories, yeah.
are the settlements?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
What happened is there was always a strain of thinking in Israel, the right wing, some of whom were religious and some of whom weren't, wanted the whole thing. I mean, both sides want the whole thing, basically, but these were people who had the power to do something to get it. And so it started small, and then over time, more and more Israeli Jews moved into areas and developed areas in those occupied territories, mostly in the West Bank. There's two areas, they're separated. The Gaza is very small and is near Egypt, and the West Bank is larger and is near Jordan. But the West Bank has some very holy places in Jewish history, and including Hebron, which is where Abraham is supposed to be buried, and
So Muslims
both
care about
both.
that
That's
very
exactly
much.
right.
And
Muslims and
Christians,
Jews.
and
Yes.
Christians,
Yes,
but Muslims
Hebron is
especially.
Hebron.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And so they have built settlements throughout the area. It's one of the very painful.
I see. So then it's Jewish concentrations
Yes.
in territory that's called occupied, because though they occupied it, they couldn't annex it, but they were allowed to, to maintain an occupation.
Not to annex it because they didn't want to have all those Palestinians become citizens. Because the issue of having a Jewish state was considered an important one, so the choice was not to annex it.
Oh, so to keep it more just Jewish people and not Palestinian people.
Well, not to annex. I mean, there's millions of between between the West Bank and Gaza. There's millions of Palestinian people, and yes, Israel did not want to have
demarcate,
a huge,
keep a line between that. You wanted to talk about a wall that is being built now. So we have the occupied territory that isn't annexed with the settlements in it.
Right.
And how is that wall being built?
Okay. Well, one of the things is that there are now about 200,000 Jewish settlers in areas within the West Bank and Gaza, and then another 200,000 in East Jerusalem, which had been Arab East Jerusalem. So it's 400,000 settlers altogether. Everybody knows, I mean, the whole world knows that the only way there's going to be any possibility of some kind of reconciliation in our lifetime would be if Palestinians have a state of their own, and it would be in the areas that are now occupied in the West Bank and Gaza and in the Arab part of Jerusalem, in Arab East Jerusalem. But in order for that to happen, for them to even have their 22%, the settlements would have to be evacuated, so the settlers would have to go back to Israel, and they would have to have the whole area. What's happening now is the opposite of that. The settlers are trying to take more land, and there are I see in the Boston Globe there were sometimes photos of struggles with soldiers because they're not supposed to, under a new peace plan, they're not supposed to be taking more land and putting in new settlements. But so there's some struggles, but the big settlements are continuing to expand. And Israel is building a wall, which has people call it by different things: a separation wall, an apartheid wall. Some people call it a fence, which is ridiculous. It looks like a prison wall. I used to do prison work in Pennsylvania. This looks like the wall of a maximum security prison. It is 30 feet high, about 30 feet high. It is massive. There are trenches on either side. There's electrification. There
like
are
the
guard
Berlin
towers.
Wall.
Yeah, I never saw the Berlin Wall in
Neither
person.
did I,
but it was,
so
yes,
then you
people
can
talk about
imagine,
that.
because I remember all the
Massive,
kinds of
massive.
securities then
Yeah.
that you have to build around the wall, because
Yes.
people find ways to try to
That's
get
exactly
over a
right,
wall.
and they're-
So
and
then
they're
you
doing
have
that.
all that creepy stuff that has to go on to
that's
maintain
exactly
the wall.
what's going on. So it's being built now, and it is not being built on the border between Israel and the occupied territories. If it were being, and Israel's rationale for it is that it's a security wall, because many Palestinians, for a lot of reasons, and I don't think I have time to go into it, have largely in response to the fact that there is a fairly brutal occupation going on, have turned against Israelis and have turned them, I mean, they've become suicide bombers. They don't have the kind of massive weaponry made in the United States that the Israelis have. And Palestinians have come into Israel and have created an enormous amount of fear. In Israel proper, buses blow up. I mean, it's the kind of thing we do hear about in our news. Pizza parlors, restaurants and hotels. There have been some really terrible, terrible things going. There's killings on both sides. Far more Palestinians have been killed in the last few years than Israelis. We hear more in this country about Israelis. But the suicide bombings do cause people to be terribly, terribly fearful. Ordinary people, and I happen to know a number of peace activists or people in peace activist families have been killed in suicide bombings. I mean, all of it is terrible, but that particularly, I have to say, breaks my heart. So the rationale for the wall that's given to the world and is accepted by many people is that, well, we need to protect ourselves. But if you're going to do that, you put it on your border. They're not putting it on the border. They're putting it so that the settlements will be incorporated on the Israeli side.
Really?
So they're taking another, I'm not sure what the percentage is because we don't know exactly where the wall is going to go, but it's cutting hugely into the Palestinian areas, taking some of the best farmland, separating some Palestinian villages from their own agricultural land. The villages are on one side and the land is on another. Some of the Palestinian villages are actually going to be on the wrong side of the wall. They're going to be on the Israeli side of the wall because of the way the wall is being constructed to take have the settlements be part of Israel. It is absolutely horrifying. And in this country, there's all the talk about the peace process.
Exactly.
And the
this
roadmap,
seems very contradictory to negotiation.
It's tremendously contradictory. It is unbelievably contradictory. And in fact, what it is doing is on the ground, and someone coined years ago the term facts on the ground to describe what Israelis are doing to take things away from Palestinians. And they meant at the time the settlements, which is true. But now there's this wall that is a massive, massive, massive fact on the ground that is going to destroy any possibility for a meaningful Palestinian life in a real state. And I think the real aim of it is to make life so difficult that people will leave. I mean, one of the fears that Palestinians have and that people who support them have is that they'll be transferred out, that they'll just be pushed out in some massive push. It doesn't look as if that's what's going to happen, because I think the Israelis don't think they can get away with it. But what seems to be happening is things are being done to make life so miserable that those who can leave will leave, and there's some of that going on.
Does it ever make people question their raison d'etre of how they're going about things? Do you ever start to get into the paradoxical nature of all of it?
Well, we do. I mean, I work with peace activists, and I work with, and I do have to say, it's hard for me to talk about this because it makes it sound as if, you know, all Jews are bad and all Jews who support a Jewish state are bad. And I have extraordinarily positive experiences with Israeli Jewish peace activists, some of whom do consider themselves Zionists, some of whom don't. Many of them work very closely with Palestinians, and it's very moving, you know, what they do. They see the paradoxes all the time, and that the actions of their own government, their leadership, you know, Ariel Sharon particularly, are exactly the actions that will instigate more terrorism against them. I mean, you can track it. You can see acts that they take in a whole variety of ways that then lead to terror attacks against Israeli Jews, and then the population gets very fearful and angry. And you know, they're not going to, you know, so many people who are probably very good, decent people aren't going to oppose this wall because they think it makes them safe. In the same way it happens in this country with prison walls. And people, you know, it's disgusting.
Or some of the measures we're taking because of the events of terror
that
are only fostering it and festering it.
Yes, absolutely.
The same thing.
It's totally,
you kind of get paranoid in a way. You build a paranoia kind of. And paranoid people do.
And there are one thing I wanted to add, because people from Roxbury have been involved in this, and I hope that you will interview them. There's a movement called the International Solidarity Movement, which is a movement in support of Palestinians. It's Palestinian-led, Palestinian-organized. It's totally a nonviolent resistance movement, and it brings people in from all over the world to help protect them against a lot of the evils of occupation. One woman was killed, one wonderful young woman was killed when she tried to stop the demolition of a Palestinian, I think it was a pharmacist's home. She stood in front of the bulldozer and she was run over and killed. Others have been shot trying to save Palestinian children. There are people, including from this community, who've ridden in ambulances to make sure ambulances can get through. Now, because Israel they have checkpoints supposedly to check for terrorists, to stop people from coming, you know, from moving from town to town and coming into Israel. But in fact, they stop women in labor from getting to the hospital. They stop people who need dialysis. They stop students from getting to school. So there are people, very, very brave, very courageous people from our country and our community and all
the
over the world
I know.
who are going to provide assistance. And you know, and Israelis are working with them. There are Israeli Jews who are working with them also collaboratively on that. Yeah.
So there are a lot of nonviolent Palestinians, nonviolent Israelis that are just fatigued.
No, they're working. No, they
fatigued
keep going.
of all the.
Oh yeah, well, who wants to live with that kind of?
Yeah,
who
of
wants
all
to
the
live with
insanity.
But they do.
Weary of insanity.
Weary, but they keep on keeping on. I don't know how they do it. I really don't know how they keep on.
And how much pain must be being endured by both sides.
Tremendous.
that they're carrying.
tremendous.
I mean, they must be depressed
Tremendous.
people.
And the-
Because think of
yeah.
all the deaths that they have
Well, and the children. I mean, the children. I mean, there's incredible stories. I'm on the board here of something called the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, which supports a program in Gaza run by the first Palestinian psychiatrist in Gaza. And he comes here periodically and speaks, and he talks about the work with the kids, the Palestinian kids, and they don't believe there's even going to be a future. You know, it's hard for them. They've seen so much destruction in their lives, and there is some romanticization of violence too. You know, and when you see so much violence, I mean, one of the things that made me so sad to hear him say is that the kids play soldier, you know, which is Israeli soldier and Palestinian, and they fight with each other to who's going to be the soldier. These are Palestinian kids wanting to be the soldier because that's the strong,
that's the power.
That's the power. Yeah. So there's a tremendous amount. I mean, I think Jews are a very damaged people out of our own history, and I think Palestinians are becoming a very damaged people out of their history now too. It's very sad. Two very damaged people, both of whom see themselves as victims, and in some ways both are.
Right.
You know,
and there's so
yeah.
much damage going around in the world.
Yeah.
Oh,
There is
boy.
a different. There is certainly. I mean, there is a growing sense, however, that the U.S. is so far from being an honest broker, that the U.S. role in support of Israel.
Why?
Well, it's a very complicated business. I mean, there is a very effective lobby, pro-Israel lobby in Washington that does a lot of work on behalf of, to get support, particularly to get financial support and military support for Israel. But there is also now, there is a growing community of people on the Christian evangelical right who are supporting that out of a very strange, I mean, to me it's a very strange theological view that all the Jews in the world need to come to that part of the world before the Armageddon, and then there will be the second coming, and then the Jews are going to get either killed or converted. But in the meantime, there is a tremendous amount of support for Israel, including for the settlers and the settlements. They are getting more money now, more support from U.S. Christian evangelicals, the right-wing ones, than they are even from U.S. Jews. So, and Bush is very open to that. I mean, you know, to that movement.
He's
very open to that movement. There's so it's a whole it's now a combination.
Something
of
about that movement having a big part in his trip to Africa too.
Really?
I don't quite, but that they were very favorable to that.
Really? Yeah, probably because of missionary. I mean, there might have been some missionary
and to get
things,
in on the AIDS and, you know, get into the religious aspects and so on.
It all makes me very uncomfortable. I mean, and it's like the most right-wing elements in both the Jewish and Christian communities who are working now very explicitly and publicly working together. It's very creepy and awful. So we work with so Jews on the left work with Christians on the left. I mean, there's been a lot of work together.
And what would you see finally as a state or state of affairs in a just peace, territorially and governmentally?
Sure, yeah.
And economically.
Well, I mean, one of the things is that I trust the people who say that Palestinians feel the need to go through the stage of having their own state, of developing their own institutions. So I would, as a step in their development, in their political development. So I would certainly support that there be a state in the West Bank and Gaza, in the 22%, that they should at least have that, and that then there needs to be some resolution of the refugee situation, which is very, very difficult. But I think that Israel would have to acknowledge its role in the creation of the refugee problem, which it's never done. It has to acknowledge the harm that was done to them. And then, there needs to be some negotiations about what would happen to the refugees, that some would be able to come back to Israel proper. Most of their, a lot of their homes have been destroyed and their communities have been built over, but some should be able to come back, some would be able to go to the new Palestinian state, some would be able to be repatriated where they are, come to the United States, go to Canada, whatever. I mean, that's a complicated business. Ultimately, in my heart of hearts, it would be one state. In my heart of hearts, it would be the old, some version of the binational vision. I think it's, in practice, it has been impossible to maintain the notion of a Jewish majority state and not to have profoundly racist elements be a part of it. And I say that as someone who understands as deeply as I understand anything that why Jews felt a need to have a state, at the point in history that they did. but I think we're beyond that now, and I think it ultimately would be a better world if it were truly either a binational or a democratic secular state in the area.
So, secular state.
Could be
Is
secular,
it a religious state now, would
well,
you say?
it's a religious state not because most of the founders were religious, they mostly weren't, but in order to get coalitions to get things through in their they have a very strange system in the Knesset. In order to get in order to get things through, they've had to have coalitions with religious groups, and so therefore the religious have a very strong influence. I mean, there aren't civil marriages. There are only religious marriages. If a Jew were to marry a Muslim or a Christian, they couldn't do it inside Israel. There is all kinds of special dispensations of various kinds for the religious communities. They don't have to serve in the army, whereas other Israeli Jews or have to serve in the army.
Oh,
Yeah, the religious don't have to serve in the army. Yeah, Arabs don't have to serve in the army either, but they lose certain benefits because of that. But religious Jews don't have to serve in the army, and they tend to get the benefits anyway. So there are ways in which it's a religious state. Yeah.
I see. Well, this is
a lot.
Yes, it's a lot. It's complicated. It's very sad. In closing, what kind of work does Jewish Women for Justice in Israel and Palestine do? Do you go out and talk about it, or what do you mostly?
Well, part of it is what I'm
doing right now.
We, a number of us are in a group called Women in Black, which is a support for Israeli women who, for, I don't know, maybe 15 years now, have been standing, they go at a particular time, standing on street corners dressed in black with signs saying "End the occupation." So we do that here. We work in coalition with other groups, including Palestinian groups. We do actions. There's an action that's been going on and off for several weeks now, where people have devised stop signs that look like the stop sign that you would see on the street, and it would be stop Israeli settlements, stop demolishing Palestinian homes, and the people would stand in busy places at busy times and then hand out literature about what's going on. We did an action around the issue of WBUR. I don't know if you know, but the public radio station here has been attacked by people who say it's anti-Israel, and we don't agree with that, and so we did an action around that. We do both political action and education, and give each other support. This is hard. This is emotionally hard work for those of us who feel some connection as Jews to that place, and deep, deep pain over what is being done in our names.
If you really think about it, it is very painful. You could just start crying.
Yes.
I don't think we really think about it.
Right.
Like
It's
a lot
true.
of things, you can't bear. How would you
Right.
carry on? You
Yeah,
wouldn't
it's-
carry
yeah,
on.
Yeah.
So you'd just like things to be peaceful. You'd like to see peace.
In this context, people don't, it's important that it not just be peaceful, but that there be some measure of justice also. Some
Peace.
measure of justice.
Peace with justice.
Yeah.
And I see
Some
I'm
measure of
getting the
justice.
signal that we're at the end.
Okay.
So I hope that this has been informative to get a better grip on this matter about which we hear little snippets every day that hardly tell the story. And I do think that in this presentation we made great inroads into having a better picture of what it's all about. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with you again soon with another session of Toward a Quality of Life. Good evening. This program is brought to you by the Psychological Services of Dr. Nancy Mroczek.